The World War II soldier has finally come home.
And he was welcomed home as a hero.
It's been 22 years. It's very complicated feeling I have right now. But however, I also, part of my feeling, I feel as if I was here yesterday.
Rejecting the imperial order, denying the officer's command, and refusing to believe even his own brother, Hiroo Onoda lived in solitude for 30 years.
Every Japanese soldier was prepared for death, but as an intelligence officer, I was ordered to conduct guerrilla warfare and not to die. I had to follow my orders as I was a soldier.
And here, I have the remarkable story of his resilience and resistance that shook the whole world. Who would have thought that an ordinary farmer's son will turn out to be a hero for the Japanese people? But Hiroo made it all possible. Born on March 19, 1922, Hiroo was brought up in a traditional Japanese manner. He started his career working in a Japanese firm present in China. But fate had other plans for Onoda. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on American base in Pearl Harbor, and it started the war journey for the country and its most dedicated soldier as well. Right after 1 year of the military strike, Onoda was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army and received training as an intelligence officer. Here he was taught the methods of guerrilla warfare. And this is what paved the way for him to reach Lubang Island in the Philippines in the year 1944. This happened during what I would call the peak of World War II. Filled with patriotism, Onoda made a promise to himself, a promise to fight for his dear land till his last breath. Yes, he took it literally. Now, coming back to the troop that consisted of 4 members including Onoda, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shuchi Shimada, and Private Kanishi Kozaka. They were all deployed to Lubang Island. One thing you must get straight before we move forward is the final words of Onoda's imperial commanding officer to him. Making him the 2nd Lieutenant, Major Yoshimi Tangachi stated some words that became engraved in his heart, that whatever happens to you, you are forbidden to die by yourself. If the war ends or something else happens, we will come for you and will find you. Now it may take 5 years or more, but till then, you're supposed to stay where you are. And these words became the only reason why the Onoda lived for 30 years on the lone island. Now this guerrilla force, which by the way is a group of soldiers initially, and especially trained to sabotage the enemies by ambushing attack and sneaking tactics, was deployed to fight the enemy's allied forces. Now, on one side, these 4 were fighting hard to win the war, and on the other, Japan had surrendered. On September 2, 1945, the Japanese army accepted his defeat. While the allied forces managed to take down several groups like Onoda, his 3 soldiers managed to come out safely every time, using unique tactics their commander had taught them. But there was another problem: food resources. 4 weeks after the war had ended, the ration these soldiers brought with them began to end. And this started another battle between the islanders and the guerrilla force. They began to raid the farmlands, sabotage enemies' fishing boats. In other words, they used every other means to exploit the islanders. The local residents frequently reported the incidents to the Philippine police, describing sightings of armed men who were believed to be Japanese holdouts. In response, the Philippine police and military conducted several search operations to find and capture the rogue soldiers. However, the dense jungle and Onoda's training made him and his commanders elusive. This brings us to the second turning point of Onoda's life, and that was denial. After initial reports of Japanese soldiers' presence, leaflets were dropped over the jungle to inform them of Japan's surrender. These leaflets, written in Japanese, urged the soldiers to come out, assuring them that the war was over. However, Onoda and his group dismissed them as enemy propaganda, thinking they were a trick. Later, efforts included dropping letters and photographs from the soldiers' families, hoping to convince them of the war's end. Again, these were met with skepticism. The authorities even used loudspeakers to broadcast messages into the jungle and sent delegations, including his own brother, to call out Onoda and his men. But even after all these efforts, they remain unconvinced. To cut it short, despite numerous attempts by authorities and local residents, Onoda and his companions remained steadfast in their belief that they were still on active duty. During this time, the group's size also dwindled. The first to leave was Akatsu, who surrendered to the Philippine forces in 1950 after becoming disillusioned with the prolonged struggle. Shimada also lost his life in a skirmish with local forces in 1954. Kozaka continued with Onoda until he too was lost in a confrontation with the Philippine officer in 1972. It wasn't until 1974 when Norio Suzuki, a Japanese adventurer, ventured to find Onoda that significant progress was made. Suzuki managed to locate Onoda, and the first thing Onoda did was to troll Suzuki by wearing socks over a sandal. Yes! Even after 10,000 days in isolation, his humor was still there. Suzuki befriended him, but Onoda still refused to surrender without formal orders from his superior officer. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs and evidence of his encounter, prompting the Japanese government to locate Onoda's former superior, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. In March 1974, Taniguchi traveled to Lubang Island and officially relieved Onoda of his duty, convincing him that the war had indeed ended. Onoda then surrendered on March 9, 1974, after nearly 30 years, ending one of the largest known instances of prolonged warfare resistance. Upon his return to Japan, Onoda received widespread attention and became a symbol of extreme dedication and loyalty. He wrote a memoir about his experiences titled No Surrender: My 30-Year War, which was published in 1974. After returning to civilian life, Onoda became involved in various activities, including writing, public speaking, and managing a ranch. He also established a youth nature school in Brazil. Living a life full of adventure and thrill, Hiroo Onoda passed away on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91. This reminds me of another soldier's story similar to that of Onoda. Shuichi Yaku. Shuichi Yaku was a sergeant in the Imperial Japanese Army who served in the 38th Infantry Regiment during World War II. After the U.S. forces recaptured Guam in 1944, Yoko, along with a few comrades, went into hiding in the dense jungle to avoid capture. Over time, his fellow soldiers surrendered, leaving Yoko to survive alone. For nearly 28 years, he lived in a self-constructed underground cave, subsisting on a diet of wild plants, shrimp, frogs, and rats. He fashioned clothing from tree bark and avoided contact with the local population, fearing they might be hostile. On January 24, 1974, Yoko was discovered by two local hunters. Initially, he thought they were enemy soldiers and attempted to defend himself, but he was eventually overpowered. When Yoko was brought back to Japan, he was welcomed as a national hero, despite his own feelings of embarrassment for having survived while the war had long since ended. He famously said, "It is with such embarrassment that I return." Yoko went on to become a television personality, sharing his survival skills and experiences that made him quite a celebrity. Suwacha Koji. Corporal Koji was a Japanese soldier who found himself stranded in the Philippines following Japan's surrender in 1945. Despite the end of World War II, Koji refused to surrender and instead chose to continue his fight in the jungles of the Philippines. For over a decade, he evaded capture, relying on his survival skills and knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. Koji's days were spent in solitude, with little contact with the outside world. However, in 1957, after more than a decade of hiding, Koji finally surrendered to Philippine authorities. His story highlights the resilience and determination of soldiers who found themselves isolated long after the conclusion of the war, as well as the psychological toll of prolonged isolation and conflict. Hiroo Nakamura. Hiroo Nakamura, an Amish, Taiwanese, Japanese soldier, served in the Imperial Japanese Army, stationed on Moroto Island in Indonesia. After the Allied forces took over the island in 1944, Nakamura retreated deep into the jungle. Unlike other holdouts, Nakamura lived in complete isolation, unaware of Japan's surrender. He survived by cultivating a small garden and hunting. His solitary existence continued for nearly 30 years. Nakamura was discovered by the Indonesian Air Force on December 18, 1974, when a search party found his hut. He was the last known Japanese holdout to surrender, as his discovery came after that of Hiroo Onoda. Nakamura returned to Taiwan, where he received only limited recognition and a modest pension compared to other holdouts. Despite his extraordinary endurance, his story remained less publicized. Bunzo Minagawa. Private Bunzo Minagawa was a Japanese soldier who continued to fight in the Philippines long after the conclusion of World War II. Despite Japan's surrender in 1945, Minagawa refused to surrender to Allied forces and instead chose to continue his fight in the jungles of the Philippines. For over a decade, he evaded capture, relying on his survival skills and knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. Minagawa's days were spent in solitude and with little contact with the outside world. However, in 1957, after more than a decade of hiding, Minagawa finally surrendered to Philippine authorities. His story serves as a poignant reminder of the lasting impact of war on individuals and the extraordinary lengths to which some soldiers went to continue their fight, long after the conflict had ended. Yamakage Kufuku and Matsuda Lunsaki. Private First Class Yamakage Kufuki and Corporal Matsuda Lunsaki were part of a group of Japanese soldiers and civilians stranded on Anaton Island in the Marianas after a U.S. raid in June 1944. Following the raid, about 30 Japanese soldiers and several Japanese and Korean civilians found themselves isolated on the island. The group initially worked together to survive, salvaging supplies from wrecked ships and utilizing the island's natural resources. Life on Anaton was harsh, with limited food and water, leading to internal conflicts and power struggles. The situation deteriorated further as tensions rose, resulting in violent confrontations within the group. Despite these challenges, Kufuku and Lunsaki managed to survive. In June 1950, their presence was discovered by a U.S. Navy ship passing near the island. The Navy made several attempts to communicate with the stranded group, but it wasn't until leaflets were dropped informing them that the war had ended that the survivors began to believe it. Convinced by these efforts and the presence of Japanese officials, the remaining members of the group, including Kufuku and Lunsaki, were rescued and repatriated to Japan. Their ordeal highlighted the extreme lengths to which Japanese soldiers went to fulfill their duty, enduring years of hardship and isolation. Shuichi Shimada. Corporal Shuichi Shimada was a Japanese soldier who found himself isolated in the jungles of the Philippines after World War II. Despite Japan's surrender in 1945, Shimada refused to surrender and instead chose to continue his fight, hiding deep within the dense jungle terrain. Shimada's days were spent in constant vigilance, with little contact with the outside world. However, in 1966, nearly 21 years after the war had ended, Shimada was finally discovered by local authorities. His story serves as a testament to the resilience and determination of soldiers who found themselves isolated long after the conclusion of the war, as well as the psychological and emotional toll of prolonged conflict and isolation. Fumo Nakara. Fumo Nakara was another Japanese soldier who remained hidden long after the end of World War II. Nakara served in the Philippines, and after the Japanese surrender, he retreated into the mountains of Mindoro Island. Like his counterparts, Nakaru lived off the land, relying on his survival skills to hunt and gather food. His story of isolation persisted until 1980, when he emerged from hiding. Nakaru's discovery came much later than others, highlighting the prolonged effects of wartime indoctrination and the difficulty of communication in remote areas. After his return to Japan, Nakaru was reunited with his family and received considerable media attention. His long survival in the wilderness added another chapter to the legacy of Japanese holdouts, illustrating the deep sense of duty and the challenges faced by soldiers isolated from the outside world. Iya Yamagachu. Private First Class Iya Yamagachu was a Japanese soldier who remained hidden in the mountains of the Philippines after the end of World War II. Despite Japan's surrender in 1945, Yamagachu refused to surrender to Allied forces and instead chose to continue his fight against perceived enemies. For over a decade, he evaded capture, relying on his survival skills and knowledge of the terrain to avoid detection. Yamagachu's days were spent in solitude, with little contact with the outside world. However, in 1957, after more than 10 years of hiding, Yamagachu finally surrendered to Philippine authorities. His story highlights the extraordinary lengths to which some soldiers went to continue their fight, long after the conclusion of the war, as well as the psychological and emotional toll of prolonged conflict and isolation. Tadashi Mizoshima. Sergeant Tadashi Mizoshima was a Japanese soldier who found himself isolated in the jungles of the Philippines after World War II. Despite Japan's surrender in 1945, Mizoshima refused to surrender and instead chose to continue his fight, hiding deep within the dense jungle terrain. For nearly 17 years, he evaded capture, relying on survival skills and knowledge of the environment to avoid detection. Mizushima's days were spent in constant vigilance, with little contact with the outside world. However, in 1962, nearly 2 decades after the war had ended, Mizushima was finally discovered by local authorities. His story serves as a testament to the resilience and determination of soldiers who found themselves isolated long after the conclusion of the war, as well as the psychological and emotional toll of prolonged conflict and isolation. Hideo Karokawa. Private First Class Hideo Karokawa was a Japanese soldier who found himself stranded in the Philippines following Japan's surrender in 1945. Despite the end of World War II, Karokawa refused to surrender and instead chose to continue his fight in the rugged terrain of the Philippines. Karokawa's days were spent in solitude, with little contact with the outside world. However, in 1957, after more than 10 years of hiding, Karokawa finally surrendered to Philippine authorities. Saburo Miyamoto. Second Lieutenant Saburo Miyamoto was a Japanese officer who remained hidden in the jungles of the Philippines after World War II. Despite Japan's surrender in 1945, Miyamoto refused to surrender and instead chose to continue his fight, hiding deep within the dense jungle terrain. However, in 1958, nearly 13 years after the war had ended, Miyamoto was finally captured by Philippine authorities. His story serves as a testament to the resilience and determination of soldiers who found themselves isolated long after the conclusion of the war, as well as the psychological and emotional toll of prolonged conflict and isolation.